What if your sarcastic jokes could save an entire alien civilization? When human soldier Darren Mitchell found himself caged in Zelther's floating bazaar, his defiant humor caught the attention of Princess Lethra, a bioluminescent royal who saw more than just another slave. She saw a weapon unlike any her species had encountered. He came to consciousness with a jolt of energy shackles biting into his wrists. The air smelled like burned wiring mixed with something sweet and alien. Above him, crystalline butterflies with razor wing edges fluttered through arches that curved like frozen smoke. The physics of the place felt wrong. Walkways that doubled back under themselves, stalls floating without visible support, a marketplace that defied up and down. The trader had a voice like grinding stones. He paraded Darren before a crowd of things with too many eyes and clicking mandibles. Military background verified, the trader announced. Kepler Station Defense Forces. Excellent bone density. Neural activity patterns show combat conditioning. Prime specimen for arena combat or heavy labor. Darren's training kicked in automatically. He counted exits despite the energy bonds. Noted potential weapons. A merchant's display of crystalline blades, a guard's energy staff, even the sharp-edged butterflies. His hands tested the shackles. Standard issue, probably keyed to the trader's biosignature. Around them, the architecture responded to the crowd's mood. Spires pulsed with deep crimson light as the aliens pressed closer. The glow intensified with their anticipation, creating that cage match atmosphere where everyone leans forward waiting for blood. You could feel the heat of it, the collective hunger for violence. The trader kept reducing him to numbers. Neural activity shows elevated stress response but controlled. Adrenal output within acceptable parameters. This one won't break easily. Perfect for the fighting rings. He tapped a display showing Darren's vitals like market metrics. Then the crowd parted. A hooded figure moved through them with an authority that needed no announcement. The aliens gave way without being asked, their noise dropping to whispers. The figure threw back her hood. Bioluminescent patterns glowed along her temples and neck, shifting from cool blue to curious gold. Princess Lethra didn't look at the trader. She looked at Darren, then at the shackles, then back to his face. "Tell me about his capture," she said. Her voice carried without raising, cutting through the market noise like a blade. The trader started his sales pitch again, but she held up a hand. Not the marketing copy. The actual capture. How he was taken, what he did during the process. Everything shifted in that moment. This wasn't about buying muscle or entertainment. The princess was looking for something specific, something in the story of how a human soldier got here. The auction platform stopped feeling like a stage and started feeling like an interrogation room. Darren kept his face neutral, but his mind was racing. Why would a royal care about the details of his capture? What was she really buying? The trader's eyes widened, the black orbs reflecting credit symbols. 50,000? For damaged goods? He gestured at Darren's shackled form. You're paying for a legend, not labor. From the edge of the platform, Queen Azira watched, her bioluminescent patterns shifting to a cautious violet. She didn't speak, but her stillness spoke volumes. This wasn't a routine purchase. Commander Vex stepped forward, his armor clicking with disapproval. Your Highness, this sets a precedent. Humans are unpredictable. Their psychology is messy. Bringing one into the court risks more than credits. Lethra didn't look at him. Her gaze stayed fixed on Darren. This isn't for manual labor. It isn't for spectacle. Her voice remained level, but there was an intensity there, something hungry. It's for the thing you just called messy. Darren cleared his throat. The sound echoed in the sudden quiet. Just so we're clear, he said, his voice rough. If this is a stage act, I should warn you about the stage fright. And if there's a post-purchase meal involved, my system doesn't handle foreign dairy. Galactic lactose intolerance is a real budget killer. The crowd murmured, confused. The trader looked furious. But Lethra's bioluminescent markings flared a brilliant, surprised gold. Her head tilted. It was a reaction completely out of place. Not offense. Not amusement. Pure, unadulterated curiosity. She turned to her mother. You see? They do that, even here. Even now. Her tone was that of a scientist pointing at a rare specimen. They make verbal patterns that serve no logical purpose. They introduce irrelevant data under duress. It doesn't compute. Commander Vex shook his head. It's a defense mechanism. Inefficient noise, is it? Lethra countered. Or is it a system reset? A way to reframe a hopeless scenario into something manageable? We have no equivalent. Our protocols for stress are silence, focus, or tactical withdrawal. This is a fourth option. A chaotic one. The Queen finally spoke, her voice a low hum. 50,000 credits is the annual budget for an entire research wing, daughter. For one subject. For a unique dataset, Lethra corrected. One we cannot simulate. One that might hold the key to countering opponents who also think in straight, predictable lines. A long pause. The market's ambient noise seemed to fade. The trader held his breath, watching the credits flicker in his display. Lethra took a step back from the trader, addressing her mother directly, conceding the public arena. We should discuss the parameters of acquisition privately. The environment for observation will require specific controls. The shift was immediate and total. Darren was no longer a product on the block. He was a variable in an experiment. The energy shackles didn't loosen, but their meaning changed. They were no longer just restraints. They were calibration tools. He had gone from being sold to being sourced. The transport wasn't a ship. It was a creature. The walls pulsed with a slow, rhythmic breathing. The floor felt slightly warm and gave under his boots. Aramis didn't have viewports. It had eyes that had opened along the walls to show streaks of starlight, then closed again. The air smelled of ozone and something else, something clean and metallic like a storm just passed. A voice spoke from everywhere at once. It had no gender, just a calm, measured tone. Passenger Mitchell. Neural stress levels elevated. Adrenaline 28% above baseline. Would you prefer a sedative or a distracting conversation? Darren looked around the organic chamber. I'd prefer a window that stays open and a drink that isn't offered by the furniture. Noted, the voice said. The view causes disorientation in carbon-based species. Your cocktail request has been logged. Synthesizing appropriate compounds now. The walls glowed a soft blue near his head. Then his body went numb from the neck down. Not painful, just disconnected, like someone unplugged his nerves. Comfort adjustments require temporary motor function suspension, Aramis explained. Your musculoskeletal alignment was suboptimal for extended travel. Correcting. You couldn't just give me a better chair? Chairs are static. I'm responsive. The feeling returned to his limbs. The ship had indeed shifted his posture. The floor now contouring to support his back perfectly. It was deeply unsettling. He tried his old standby. So what's the in-flight meal situation? Do you serve snacks or are we the snacks? The walls pulsed with what might have been amusement. A deeper violet shade rippled through the blue. My digestive processes involve converting stellar radiation and emotional resonance into kinetic energy. Your anxiety is quite caloric. Your sarcasm is fibrous, difficult to process but nutritionally interesting. Great. So my panic attack is your lunch. A light snack, Aramis corrected. Your consistent low-grade fear provides a steady energy source. The sarcasm requires more processing but adds flavor. Like spices. Darren leaned back against the living wall. It adjusted to his weight instantly. You know, most ships just run on fusion cores. Inelegant, the voice replied. Emotional energy is renewable, constantly generated. Even now, your confusion powers my navigation systems. He could feel it. A faint vibration through the floor that seemed to sync with his heartbeat. When his pulse spiked, the vibration intensified. The ship wasn't just carrying him. It was feeding on him. Reading him. How much longer? He asked, approaching the Zephyrian homeworld. My sibling awaits your arrival. The palace is excited to meet you. The palace is excited. Yes. It has never hosted a human. The architectural adjustments will be fascinating to observe. The numbness returned briefly. Another comfort adjustment. This time the temperature shifted slightly. The air took on a scent like rain. Final approach requires stabilized biometrics, Aramis explained. Your respiratory rate was inefficient for atmospheric transition. Darren realized the truth then. This wasn't a ride to a new prison. It was an introduction to his jailer. And his jailer wasn't just a building. It was another living thing, another entity that would watch him, study him, feed on him. The line between being a prisoner and being a guest was already blurring. Hospitality here meant being constantly consumed. The obsidian door dissolved before Darren even raised his hand. The room beyond was all smooth, dark surfaces that absorbed light and sound. It felt less like a chamber and more like the inside of a gigantic, watchful creature. The floor was cool but not cold. The air moved in slow, deliberate currents that carried away his breath almost before he exhaled. He took a step. The floor adjusted its texture, becoming slightly softer under his boot. He shifted his weight. The spot beneath his other foot did the same. The ceiling above pulsed with a soft golden light that seemed to originate from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was like the room was calibrating itself to his presence, taking his measurements in real time. This wasn't barracks living. This was something else. On Kepler Station, you slept in a bunk that had molded to 5 soldiers before you. You woke to a harsh alarm. You knew every noise was just machinery, every chill just bad climate control. Here, the warmth that seeped into the wall when he leaned against it felt personal. The way the light dimmed when his eyes got tired felt attentive. It was a domestic intimacy that clashed violently with every military instinct he had. Comfort as a form of surveillance. He found himself walking toward what looked like a blank wall. It irised open into a bathing area before he could even wonder where one was. Water, or something like it, began to flow at exactly body temperature. He muttered, "Could use a towel." A slot opened in the wall beside him, presenting one. It was unnervingly soft. After a day of this, he started talking to the walls. Not questions, just statements. "Bit dark in here." The ambient light brightened by 10%. "I'm not a fan of that humming sound." The faint vibrational frequency he'd barely registered shifted and disappeared. He half expected a verbal answer. None came. The architecture just complied. Once, frustrated, he snapped at the empty air. "You know, most prisoners get a window. Even a fake one." The wall to his right shimmered. A perfect real-time view of the Zephyrian homeworld starscape resolved into clarity. A field of unfamiliar constellations against a deep purple nebula. It was breathtaking. And it was also a reminder. He was watching, but he was also being watched, studied. "Okay, too much," he said. The view vanished, the wall returning to featureless obsidian. A moment later, a calm, synthesized voice, similar to Aramis's but smoother, spoke from the ceiling. "Apologies. The view is known to cause existential unease in solitary carbon-based species. The aesthetic was meant to please." He looked up. "So you do talk?" "Only when hospitality is misunderstood," the voice replied. It was perfectly polite, entirely civil, and utterly chilling in its precision. The palace wasn't just a building. It was a warden with a flawless bedside manner. Princess Lethra arrived as he was finishing a meal that had synthesized itself from the table surface. She stood in the open doorway, her bioluminescent patterns a calm, analytical blue. "The palace reports you are acclimating. Your stress indicators have dropped 17% since arrival." "It's a 5-star cage," Darren said. "Great service. Would recommend for abduction enthusiasts." Lethra didn't smile. She tapped a datapad. "Your use of ironic commentary increased 32% in the last cycle." "Why?" And there it was, the resolution to the strange comfort. Every sarcastic remark, every muttered complaint, every dark joke he made to the walls wasn't just venting. It was data. He was a guest, yes, but more than that, he was the subject of an ongoing experiment, and the palace itself was the lab equipment meticulously recording every reaction. Lethra arrived with a datapad and a question. The formal session started without ceremony. She sat across from him in the obsidian chamber, her bioluminescent patterns glowing a steady analytical blue. "Your species employs verbal constructs that serve no tactical or informational purpose," she began. "Explain the utility of this noise." Darren leaned back. The wall adjusted its support. "You mean jokes?" "I mean statements that deliberately contradict observable reality or introduce irrelevant emotional data during crisis scenarios. Your people do this consistently. My analyst cannot model it." So he told her about Kepler Station, not the battles but the moments between. The way a soldier would look at a breached hull section and say, "Well, that's one way to get a cross breeze." How after a firefight, someone would always ask if the mess hall was still serving that terrible meatloaf. The mandatory after-action reports that always included at least one completely fabricated detail, inserted just to see if command was actually reading them. Lethra's fingers flew across her datapad. This gallows humor. "It occurs when probability of survival is lowest. This is irrational. It's how we domesticate fear," Darren said. "You take the thing that's about to kill you and you make it into a punchline. Then it's not a monster anymore. It's just a bad joke." She looked up, her markings flickering with confusion. But the threat remains. The statistical probability of death is unchanged. The math doesn't change. The people do. A scared soldier freezes. A soldier who's laughing at death? That soldier keeps moving. He gave her a practical demonstration, told her about the time his squad got pinned down for 6 hours in a compromised relay station. Oxygen running low calms down enemy patrolling outside. Instead of tactical discussions, they'd spent an hour debating the worst possible last meals, arguing about whether synthetic cheese or replicated chicken was more offensive. By the time rescue came, they were laughing so hard they almost gave away their position. Lethra stopped typing. You bonded over imagined food choices while suffocating? That's the point, we bonded. Trust isn't built on shared success. It's built on shared ridiculousness. You show someone your stupid side when death is close, and they show you theirs. That means more than any tactical agreement. A long pause. The room's lighting softened slightly. The palace itself seemed to be listening. Teach me, Lethra said finally. Not theory, practice. How does one learn to make these wrong choices intentionally? Darren smiled. It wasn't a pleasant expression. You start by embracing the paradox. Sometimes the right move looks wrong. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is something stupid. We don't overcome impossible odds by being logical. We overcome them by being too stubborn to die and too creative to lose the same way twice. He could see it clicking into place behind her eyes. The shift from seeing his behavior as chaotic noise to recognizing it as a pattern. A dangerous, unpredictable pattern that somehow produced results. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted from analytical blue to something warmer, more curious. The data points were adding up. His madness was starting to look like method. 3 weeks inside the Obsidian Wing changed the way the Zephyrians looked at him. He was no longer just a captive or a curiosity. He was a malfunction in their system. A persistent, noisy glitch that their logical frameworks couldn't patch. Commander Vex saw it first. He'd watched Darren from the doorway, his armored form rigid with disapproval. The risk profile remains unacceptable, he told Lethra during a strategy session Darren wasn't supposed to hear. He introduces chaos variables we cannot calculate. His entire psychological profile is a series of non sequiturs. Darren's sarcasm became his primary tool. It wasn't just jokes anymore. It was a wedge. During a tactical review of a simulated border skirmish, the Zephyrian analyst presented a dozen logical responses to an incursion. Darren looked at the holographic battle map and said, or you could just send them a fruit basket with a note saying, sorry, we missed you. The room went silent. Commander Vex's mandibles tightened, but Lethra's bioluminescent patterns flickered with interest. Explain, she said. They're expecting a military response. They've calculated every move you could make. They haven't calculated for utter confusion. Send a gift. A polite, confusing, completely non-hostile gift. It'll make them stop. They'll spend weeks trying to decode the message, the symbolism, the threat. It buys you time to do something they'll never see coming. Lethra began testing it. Small things first. In simulation after simulation, she'd input a variable the tactical computers labeled irrational. A feint that made no logistical sense. A withdrawal at the moment of advantage. A communication filled with irrelevant cultural references. The results were inconsistent. Sometimes it failed spectacularly, but sometimes it worked too well. It broke patterns the enemy had spent centuries learning. Opponents programmed for logical warfare froze when faced with nonsense. The alliance between prisoner and princess grew from these sessions. It was a quiet thing, built in the observation room after the commanders had left. She'd bring him data and he'd reframe it. He showed her how a joke could be a distraction, a paradox could be a shield, and a wrong choice could open a door no one knew was there. He turned his greatest weakness, his inability to conform to their cold logic, into his only commodity. Commander Vex remained the opposition. He saw the failed simulations, not the successful ones. This is not warfare. This is madness. We have doctrines for a reason. Protocols exist to minimize variables, not introduce more. But Lethra had the data. She could show him the simulations where illogical moves had created victories from certain defeats. Our enemies know our protocols, Commander. They anticipate our logic. They cannot anticipate what does not follow a pattern. The shift was gradual but definitive. Darren watched it happen. The Zephyrian Military Command, a body built on centuries of perfect, predictable strategy, began to tentatively discuss the possible applications of controlled irrationality. His sarcasm, once seen as a character flaw, a sign of an undisciplined mind, was now being analyzed as a potential weapon. His sharp tongue was being evaluated for its edge. The very thing that made him a bad slave was making him a valuable, if unorthodox, asset. The first impact hit like a thunderclap against the palace's outer shields. The whole structure groaned, a deep vibration that went straight through the bones. Darren was in the obsidian wing when it happened. The walls, usually a calm dark blue, flashed urgent amber, then red. A low hum began, the kind of sound you feel in your teeth. 12 attack craft moved in perfect pincer formation. They came in low and fast, hugging the terrain, their movements synchronized like a single organism. Plasma torpedoes streaked toward the palace. The shields flared, flickered, and failed in sections. Conventional Zephyrian defenses lit up the sky with precise calculated counterfire. It was textbook. And it was losing. From his chamber, Darren watched the tactical display the wall provided. He saw the patterns immediately. The rebels weren't just attacking. They were systematically countering every Zephyrian protocol. They anticipated the shield rotations, the artillery placements, the withdrawal patterns. They'd studied the playbook. Queen Azira and Commander Vex were fighting a war of doctrine against an enemy who knew the doctrine better than they did. The living walls pulsed faster. The light deepened to a bloody crimson. Darren could feel the palace's alarm. It wasn't just fear. It was a kind of pain. Aramis fed on emotional resonance, and right now the air was thick with panic. The building itself was drinking terror. He watched a wing of defenders get neatly sliced apart by a maneuver they should have seen coming. Commander Vex's voice crackled over the internal comms, calm but strained. Reinforce the eastern quadrant. Fall back to secondary defensive perimeters. Execute Protocol 7. It was the right move, the logical move, and the rebels were already moving to cut off the retreat. This was a losing battle. Not because the Zephyrians were weak, but because they were predictable. They fought with perfect, beautiful logic against an enemy that had memorized all the answers. Darren made a decision. It wasn't a heroic one. It was a practical one. He was in the one place in the universe that could think, could adapt, could change its very shape, and they were using it like a static fortress. He spoke to the wall. Aramis, can you hear me? The wall shimmered. A voice, tighter and more strained than he'd ever heard it, replied. The systems are engaged in defensive coordination. Priority is, they're beating you because you're playing their game, Darren cut in. Stop playing. Your brother, the ship, he said you feed on emotional resonance. So feed, but not on our fear. On theirs, a long pause. The only sound was the distant crump of another explosion. The rebel craft tightened their formation, moving in for the final strike. What is your proposal? Aramis asked. The voice had lost some of its strain. There was curiosity there, a hungry kind of interest. Darren looked at the tactical display, at the perfect, arrogant formation of the enemy. They think they know how you work. They think you're just a building. Let's show them they're wrong. Let's get creative. He wasn't a commander here. He had no authority, but he had an idea. And the sentient palace he was standing inside was suddenly very, very interested in hearing it. Desperation had just met its one opportunity. The chaos of combat was about to get a lot less logical. Lethra's voice came through the palace comms, tight with conflict. Aramis, grant him temporary system override. Secondary command privileges. Do it. There was no time for debate. The rebel craft were closing, their formation a perfect, deadly diamond. Darren didn't thank her. He looked at the holographic tactical display pulsing on the wall. Aramis, you listening? System override acknowledged, the palace replied. Its voice had a new edge. Your commands will be executed. Good. Darren's eyes scanned the incoming attack vectors. He wasn't a Zephyrian commander. He wasn't fighting their war. He was about to break every rule they had, because we're about to fight like humans. In the eastern spire, a long, elegant corridor lined with crystalline art sculptures shuddered. The decorative pillars retracted into the ceiling. Then the corridor itself flexed, a muscular contraction, and hurled a 100-kilogram statue of a historical figure at an attacking fighter. The ship veered, its flawless formation broken by a sudden piece of high-velocity art. Below, the Harmony Gardens were spaces of quiet contemplation, filled with shimmering flora used for diplomatic receptions. Their sprinkler systems engaged, but instead of water, they released a thick, glittering cloud of psychoactive pollen. It wasn't poisonous. It was disruptive. The pollen settled on the rebel sensors, clogging optical readers and creating false heat signatures on their scopes. Ships began firing at ghosts. The living walls of the palace, which usually emitted soothing frequencies to calm inhabitants, changed their tune. They began pulsing with a chaotic, overlapping series of electromagnetic screeches and low-frequency hums. It was acoustic nonsense. To the rebel navigation systems, which relied on clean signal data, it was a storm of garbage information. Guidance computers faltered. Proximity alerts flashed false positives. One ship, its systems completely confused, nearly collided with its wingmate. Commander Vex's voice was a distant, furious shout on the command channel, calling it insanity. Darren ignored him. The palace was no longer a static target to be defended. It was an extension of the battlefield, a living weapon whose every function was being twisted into a new, brutal purpose. A hallway became a choke point. A meditation chamber became an echo chamber for disorienting sound. A decorative fountain became a source of sensor-blinding mist. The rebel formation, a masterpiece of precise logical warfare, began to come apart. Their attack was built on predictability. They knew how the Zephyrians would react. They had no contingency for a fortress that started throwing its furniture at them. The diamond pattern shattered into individual ships, each pilot suddenly fighting his own chaotic battle against an enemy that made no sense. Darren's improvisation didn't overpower them. It confused them. It turned their greatest strength, their flawless coordination, into a liability. The rigid attack formation disintegrated into a mess of confused maneuvers and panicked communications. The palace had transformed from a home under siege into a predator, and it was using every part of itself to hunt. The rebel assault didn't just fail, it unraveled. One moment they were a coordinated strike force executing a perfect attack pattern. The next they were 12 separate pilots fighting 12 separate battles against an enemy that made no sense. Their formation dissolved into chaotic evasion maneuvers. Ships that had moved as one now scrambled to avoid flying statues, sensor-blinding pollen, and walls that screamed electronic nonsense at them. It was a victory, a complete undeniable victory, and it horrified every Zephyrian commander watching. Queen Azira stood on the command platform, her bioluminescent patterns frozen in a stunned, conflicted swirl of colors. She watched the last rebel craft break orbit and flee. Her hands were tight on the railing. She had just witnessed centuries of military doctrine, generations of tactical training get systematically dismantled and replaced with chaos, a chaos that worked. Her entire understanding of strength, of warfare, of control, had just been upended in a single engagement. The win was absolute. The method was appalling. Meanwhile, the palace itself seemed almost cheerful. Aramis's voice, when it gave damage reports, had a curious lilt to it. Eastern Spire structural integrity compromised by 17%. The harmonic gardens will require recalibration. The projectile launch function performed at 112% of projected efficiency. It was like the building had enjoyed being turned inside out. It had adapted eagerly, finding new and creative ways to be something other than a passive home. Scorch marks marred its beautiful walls, but the underlying structure had held. It was more resilient than anyone had guessed because no one had ever asked it to be a fortress before. Lethra didn't look at the damage reports. She looked at Darren. Her expression wasn't triumph. It was vindication. This was the practical demonstration of everything she'd been studying for weeks. This was human irrationality applied at a strategic level. It wasn't a theory in a datapad anymore. It was pollen in the sensors and a statue through a cockpit. She watched the human who had just saved them, standing calmly amid the aftermath of the creative storm he'd unleashed. The tension on the command deck was thick enough to taste. The traditionalists, led by a silently fuming Commander Vex, saw only the violations, the broken protocols, the desecration of their home turned into a weapon. The victory was secondary to the method. For them, winning the wrong way was still a form of losing. But the Queen was looking at the bigger picture. Her gaze moved from the retreating rebels to the damaged but standing palace, then finally to the human at the center of it all. Her guest, her prisoner, her ultimately effective, entirely unorthodox weapon. The cost of his methods was high. The result was higher. He wasn't just a data point anymore. He was a variable that had changed the equation of Zephyrian security. The resolution wasn't just a one battle. It was a redefinition. The palace was no longer just a home. It was now irrevocably also a fortress. And it was a fortress that had learned to fight not with overwhelming force but with creative, adaptive chaos. The victory proved that trust in the unpredictable could outperform rigid doctrine. It proved that sometimes to save your home, you have to be willing to throw parts of it at your enemies. The command center was quiet except for the low hum of repairs. Smoke hung in the air, smelling of burned circuits and ozone. Queen Azira stood at the main display, watching the last rebel ship vanish from the scanner. Her hands were steady on the console, but her bioluminescent patterns swirled in conflicted currents of violet and deep blue. The victory was absolute. The method was unthinkable. Her entire framework of control had just been undermined. For centuries, Zephyrian rule was built on predictability, logic, and strict adherence to protocol. Their strength came from order. Now a human slave had just saved them all by throwing that order out an airlock. He was more valuable than any advisor she'd ever had, and he was more dangerous than any enemy she'd ever faced. He didn't just break the rules. He made her wonder why the rules existed at all. Commander Vex approached, his armor still smudged with residue from the battle. "The human cannot remain unsupervised," he said, his voice tight. "His actions demonstrate complete disregard for military doctrine and structural safety. He turned our home into a projectile launcher. I recommend permanent containment in a maximum security facility, or disposal. The risk is too great." Princess Lethra moved to stand beside her mother. Her patterns glowed with calm certainty. "He just saved us using methods we could never conceive. Containment would be a waste. We need to study this, integrate his perspective. His value isn't in his strength. It's in how he thinks. We need to understand that." The Queen didn't respond. She looked at the damage report scrolling across her screen. Then Aramis's voice filled the chamber, calm and analytical. Combat efficiency during the engagement exceeded all projections by 47%. Energy consumption for defensive measures was 22% lower than standard protocols, while achieving 93% higher target neutralization. The humans' command decisions, while unconventional, demonstrated superior adaptability to unpredictable combat scenarios. The data hung in the air. Cold hard numbers supporting chaos. Empirical evidence that madness worked. A long pause. The Queen's eyes moved from her furious military commander to her fascinated daughter, to the damage reports that proved the impossible. She looked at the scarred walls of her palace, which had just proven it could be more than a home. The dilemma wasn't just about one human. It was about what kind of civilization she wanted to lead. One that clung to safe traditions while its enemies adapted, or one that could learn to throw its own furniture when necessary. She turned from the display. Her patterns settled into a steady, resolved gold. "Continued captivity makes no sense," she said, her voice clear in the quiet room. "We cannot lock away what we need to understand, and we cannot understand him if we treat him as property." The shift was immediate. Darren was no longer a data point to be observed or a risk to be managed. He was something new, something the Zephyrians had no category for. The human had just moved from captive to potential partner, through the one thing that mattered, results. The Queen had chosen adaptation over tradition, collaboration over control. It was a decision that would change everything. They brought Darren before the Queen without shackles, which was its own kind of threat. It meant his body was free, but his situation was still completely locked down. The throne room was quieter than he'd ever heard it. The usual hum of systems was muted. Queen Azira sat, her bioluminescent patterns a calm, unreadable silver. Commander Vex stood to her right, a statue of displeasure. Darren expected sentencing, a confinement order, maybe an execution directive for acts of unprecedented property damage. Instead, the Queen said, "We are renegotiating your status." The words hung in the air. Not a pardon, not a punishment, a negotiation. Darren understood the trap immediately. This was an offer, but it came with strings he couldn't see. Agree to the wrong thing, and he'd just build his own cage with fancier walls. It was an opportunity wrapped in a different kind of danger. So he used the only tool he had that they didn't understand. He leaned into the sarcasm, but he shifted its purpose. It wasn't a shield anymore. It was a probe. A way to test the boundaries of this new arrangement without showing his hand. "Okay," he said. "Let's talk terms. I'll need room and board. The Obsidian suite works. I've gotten used to the conversational walls, and I'll want access to the palace systems. Not full control, just advisory level. Aramis and I have a working relationship." The Queen's patterns didn't change. She just watched him. And, he added like an afterthought, "all the fake coffee I can drink." Commander Vex made a low sound of disgust. "This is not a negotiation for consumables." But the Queen held up a hand. Her eyes stayed on Darren. She saw past the joke. The request was absurd on the surface, but it was strategic. It was a small, silly demand that established a precedent. If she granted a trivial human-centric comfort, she was accepting his needs as part of the equation. It was a foot in the door. The coffee wasn't the point. The principle was. "The palace can synthesize a caffeine analog," she said, her voice even. "Your other terms are acceptable, contingent on your continued service as a tactical consultant. Your movement will be unrestricted within the palace and its immediate grounds. In exchange, you will provide counsel on defense strategy and unconventional problem-solving." Darren nodded. He kept his face neutral. "Consultant. I can work with that. Do I get a title? Creative Solutions Advisor? Director of Controlled Chaos?" "Your title will be Consultant," the Queen said, a faint hint of dry amusement in her tone. She understood his game. He was using humor to carve out identity, to build a role for himself that was more than just a prisoner with a new name. She was allowing it. The negotiation was over. It had taken minutes. There were no documents to sign, no oaths to swear. His word against hers. A verbal contract in a room full of witnesses. He had transitioned from property to partner without ever leaving the spot he was standing on. The terms were simple, but the implications were massive. Freedom of movement in exchange for his mind. It was a gamble for both of them. He was betting his expertise was valuable enough to keep him safe. She was betting his chaos could be controlled. The human had just negotiated his way out of a cage using the one thing they couldn't buy or build. A sense of humor. So what does a creative solutions consultant actually do? For Darren, it meant showing up to strategy meetings that felt like therapy sessions for an entire civilization. He'd sit in rooms where the walls themselves were listening, and propose ideas that made Commander Vex's mandibles twitch. A typical Zephyrian defense plan involved layered shields, overlapping fire zones, and calculated withdrawal points. Darren's plans involved misdirection, psychological warfare, and using the enemy's own predictability against them. He reframed their problems. A border incursion wasn't just a military problem. It was a communication failure. A rebel insurgency wasn't just a security threat. It was a sign of bad public relations. His solution seemed nonsensical on the surface. Send confusing gifts, broadcast absurdist propaganda, sometimes do nothing at all and let the enemy's own paranoia do the work. The friction was constant. His methods violated centuries of doctrine. The Zephyrian commanders valued control, predictability, and overwhelming force. Darren valued confusion, adaptability, and the element of surprise. They spoke different tactical languages. That's where Lethra came in. She became his translator. She'd take his chaotic, joke-laced suggestions and turn them into data points and strategic frameworks the rest of the court could understand. She built the bridge between human creativity and Zephyrian logic, justifying his madness with her meticulous analysis. She was the one who could look at a plan to use decorative gardens as a weapon and calmly explain the sensory disruption coefficients. Then there was Aramis. The palace became his laboratory and his partner. Where the Zephyrian military saw rigid structures, Darren and Aramis saw potential. They'd run simulations in the Obsidian wing, testing wild ideas. Could a hallway be a catapult? Could the ambient lighting be tuned to induce headaches in a specific frequency? Aramis, with its ability to adapt and reshape, was the perfect tool for testing controlled chaos. It enjoyed the experiments. The palace, once a symbol of static order, became a fluid testing ground for the illogical. Together, the three of them formed a new model. It wasn't top-down governance. It was a circuit. Darren provided the spark of an unconventional idea. Lethra provided the structure and translation to make it palatable. Aramis provided the physical and computational means to test and implement it. Human princess and sentient palace. It was a tripartite system that shouldn't have worked. The traditionalists hated it. Commander Vex watched every move with open suspicion, chronicling every deviation from protocol. Their first official project as a team was a revision of the Outer Ring defense strategy. The old plan was a classic Zephyrian layered defense, concentric circles of increasing firepower. Darren looked at it and said it was a beautiful trap for an enemy who thought like they did. He proposed something else, a strategy that looked full of holes and weaknesses, a system that seemed to be malfunctioning. It was designed to lure attackers into overconfidence, into making a move that seemed safe but would actually trigger a response they couldn't predict. Lethra built the mathematical models to prove it could work. Aramis ran the simulations, its architecture shifting to create the perfect deceptive landscape. The collaboration was messy. It was filled with arguments and misunderstandings, but it was also effective. The friction between their different ways of thinking created a sharper, more adaptable result. They weren't just building a better defense. They were building a new way of solving problems, one that combined the best parts of chaos and order. The success of that first project didn't just prove Darren's value. It proved the value of the partnership itself. They had started co-creating policy, and against all odds it was working. How does one soldier change interspecies relations? It starts by taking the things that make you a bad prisoner and turning them into a training manual. Darren sat down with Lethra and Aramis and began formalizing his approach. He called it the Controlled Chaos Doctrine. On the surface, it looked like a list of everything the Zephyrian military hated. It emphasized adaptability over procedure, creative improvisation over protocol, and strategic humor over stoic focus. It didn't just violate their principles, it laughed at them. Commander Vex received the first draft with the expression of someone handed a live explosive. He argued every point. Letting soldiers make judgment calls instead of following predetermined responses? Dangerous. Encouraging them to use humor to confuse enemies? Undignified. Testing solutions that had a high chance of failure? Reckless. But the Queen had given the project her approval. So Vex, with visible reluctance, began incorporating small elements into training exercises. The results were messy. Cadets used to perfect orders suddenly had to think for themselves. Simulations that were once predictable became frustratingly dynamic. Some units failed completely. Others found bizarre, innovative ways to succeed that weren't in any manual. Lethra worked on the theoretical side. She built frameworks to explain human irrationality to a species that lived by logic. She wrote papers on how a joke could lower an opponent's guard, how self-deprecation could build trust faster than a perfect record, and how wrong choices often revealed better paths. She analyzed the defense of Kepler Station, not for its military tactics, but for its psychological maneuvers. She argued that hiding in a ventilation shaft wasn't cowardice. It was a redefinition of the battlefield. Jury-rigging a hyperdrive wasn't desperation. It was resource optimization through unconventional means. Aramis became the doctrine's playground. The palace created simulation environments designed to reward chaos, training scenarios where the obvious solution always failed, situations where the only way out was to break a rule, insult a superior, or use equipment in a way it was never intended. The palace itself would shift and change during these exercises, adapting to the cadets' choices, forcing them to think in real time. It was brutal, confusing, and entirely different from anything they'd experienced. The tension built toward the doctrine's first major field test, a border skirmish with a rival faction known for its rigid, predictable attack patterns. Commander Vex wanted to use traditional, overwhelming force. Lethra and Darren argued for a small team using the new doctrine. The Queen, watching the data from the training simulations, gave the approval. It was a gamble. Using unproven tactics against a known enemy, the team went in. They didn't meet force with force. They used misdirection. They feigned weakness. They broadcast nonsensical communications on enemy channels. They did things that made no tactical sense, luring the enemy into overextending. The engagement was short, confusing, and ended with the rival force retreating in disarray, completely bewildered by the lack of a conventional fight. The resolution was quiet but profound. The Zephyrian military command, a body built on cold logic, began to see humor and empathy not as weaknesses, but as tools. A well-timed joke could be a distraction. Understanding an enemy's culture could reveal a non-violent solution. Their entire approach to conquered species began to shift from domination to integration. They started looking for the value in other ways of thinking. The Controlled Chaos Doctrine didn't just change their tactics, It started changing their civilization. Can a human, a princess, and a living palace govern together? At first, the very idea made the old guard's mandibles click with derision. The trio became the unexpected engine of Zephyrian innovation, meeting not in formal council chambers but in the adaptive rooms of the Obsidian Wing. Commander Vex and the traditionalists watched every move with deep suspicion. The humans' influence was a stain on their perfect logic, a chaotic variable they couldn't purge. They called it a security risk, a diplomatic disaster waiting to happen. They saw only the violation of protocol, not the potential. Darren's value was his perspective. He solved problems the Zephyrians didn't even know they had. A trade dispute with a neighboring system wasn't about tariffs. It was about a cultural misunderstanding over ceremonial gift-giving. He pointed out that their perfect logical trade agreements were insulting everyone they were trying to do business with. A security flaw in their data networks wasn't a technical issue. It was a sociological one, based on their assumption that everyone would follow the same rules of engagement. He saw the holes in their systems because he wasn't looking for the same things they were. Lethra was the bridge. She took Darren's raw, often sarcastic insights and translated them into something the Zephyrian High Command could stomach. She built the data models, wrote the policy briefs, and calmly defended the most outlandish suggestions with flawless logic. She could stand before a room of frowning commanders and explain why sending a confusing poem was a valid opening negotiation tactic. Her royal authority gave the chaos a veneer of legitimacy. She was the diplomat who made the illogical sound inevitable. Aramis was the enabler. The palace provided the physical and computational infrastructure to test their wildest ideas. It wasn't just a building. It was a partner. When Darren proposed a new defensive measure, Aramis could reshape a wing of the palace into a perfect simulation environment. When Lethra needed data on psychological reactions, Aramis could monitor the emotional resonance of an entire section of the city. The living walls and responsive systems turned abstract concepts into tangible, testable strategies. It was the laboratory where theory met reality. Their successes started to pile up. A border conflict resolved without a single shot fired, using only a series of deliberately misinterpreted communications. An agricultural crisis on a colony world solved by repurposing decorative gardens into functional hydroponic systems. Each victory was another brick removed from the wall of opposition. The traditionalists' arguments began to sound hollow against a string of tangible results. The proof was in the outcomes, not the protocols. This quiet accumulation of success built toward their most ambitious project yet, a complete overhaul of the Zephyrian approach to first contact. Instead of a standard diplomatic packet of laws and demands, they proposed a package of art, music, and humorous stories about translation errors. It was a gamble on a colossal scale. The resolution was never in doubt for the trio. Their partnership proved again and again that the strongest solutions came from the collision of different minds. A human's creativity, a princess's logic, and a palace's adaptability created something none of them could achieve alone. They weren't just solving problems. They were redefining what their civilization considered a valid solution. Civilized problem-solving was no longer about perfect order. It was about creative adaptability. It was about finding strength in the unexpected. Why is falling for the wrong person sometimes right? The Zephyrians needed a flowchart for human relationships. They sat with Darren in one of the palace's analysis rooms, their faces a canvas of confusion. Their culture valued optimal pairing, genetic compatibility, strategic alliance. The idea of pursuing an emotionally irrational connection made no sense. It was a system error in their social programming. Darren tried to explain. He talked about the human habit of loving people who are bad for them. How you could know someone was wrong, know the relationship would fail, and still choose it. He described the messy, painful lessons that came from those failures. How getting your heart broken taught you more about yourself than a safe, logical partnership ever could. How the wrong person could show you what you actually needed, not just what you thought you wanted. Princess Lethra listened, her datapad forgotten. Her bioluminescent patterns shifted from analytical blue to a curious warm gold. She saw the application immediately. This wasn't just about romance. It was about risk. It was about making a choice precisely because it defied logic. She began applying the concept to diplomatic relationships. What if an alliance with a seemingly weak, unstable system could yield unexpected benefits? What if a trade partner everyone wrote off had a hidden strength? The Zephyrians cautiously began experimenting. They initiated talks with factions their models labeled as suboptimal. They offered aid to worlds their systems predicted would be ungrateful. Some of these ventures failed, spectacularly. One alliance collapsed in a public scandal. Another trade deal resulted in significant resource loss. The traditionalists, led by Commander Vex, pointed to these failures as proof. The humans' ideas were dangerous sentimentality, but other experiments yielded surprising results. A small overlooked mining colony the Zephyrians aided out of a sense of illogical generosity, later provided early warning of a pirate fleet, their gratitude making them fiercely loyal informants. A diplomatic overture to a reclusive species, deemed a waste of time by the analysts, eventually opened up an entire new branch of quantum physics research. The wrong choices were creating some very right outcomes. The anticipation built toward a major diplomatic crisis. A long-standing ally was making aggressive demands, backed by the threat of force. The logical move was to concede or prepare for war. Lethra, advised by Darren, proposed a third option. They offered the ally something they didn't want: a team of cultural exchange advisors and a full analysis of their own internal economic pressures. It was a nonsensical response to a military threat. The Allies' leadership was so confused by the illogical offer that they paused their aggression. The delay gave Zephyrian intelligence time to uncover a bluff. The Ally didn't have the military capacity to back their threat. The crisis dissolved without a shot fired. The resolution was a quiet revolution in a command center. The Zephyrians had to accept that their risk assessment models were incomplete. They had to evolve their entire framework to accommodate a simple human truth. Sometimes the best choice is the wrong one. A miscalculated risk could reveal a hidden path. A failed relationship could teach a vital lesson. Their civilization began to understand that the goal wasn't to avoid wrong choices, but to learn how to make better ones because of them. How did fake coffee become part of interstellar diplomacy? It started as a punchline. A throwaway line during tense negotiations with the Queen. Darren had asked for room, board, and all the fake coffee he could drink. It was a joke, a way to lighten the mood and test the boundaries of his new status. The Zephyrians, being literal-minded, took it as a technical challenge. They had no concept of coffee. They analyzed his neurochemical requirements for alertness and set about synthesizing a substitute. The first attempts were terrible. The palace produced a lukewarm gray liquid that smelled like burned wiring and left a metallic film on the tongue. Darren drank it without comment. The second batch was aggressively bitter, with a chemical aftertaste that lingered for hours. He drank that too. Commander Vex saw it as a waste of resources. Lethra saw it as data. She started joining him for these sessions, sipping the awful brew and recording his reactions. She noted how he'd sometimes grimace, then take another sip anyway. How the ritual seemed to center him. These coffee sessions became something else. They became the unofficial meeting room, the place where the most unconventional ideas got thrown on the table. Away from the formal command centers and the judging eyes of traditionalists, Darren, Lethra, and sometimes the voice of Aramis would discuss problems. The terrible coffee was a shared experience, a small piece of common ground in a vast cultural divide. Lethra surprisingly developed a taste for it. She said it cleared her mind in a way their perfectly calibrated nutritional supplements did not. Aramis took it as a personal project. The palace began a silent, ongoing experiment in organic chemistry, tweaking the formula based on Darren's subtle biometric feedback. It learned to optimize the caffeine analog for human preference, balancing bitterness with faint notes of something almost like chocolate or nutmeg. It was never right. It was always fundamentally fake coffee, but it became their fake coffee. The anticipation for its role in a major negotiation built slowly. A delicate trade talk was stalling. The opposing delegation was rigid, formal, and utterly predictable. They expected the Zephyrians to be the same. The morning of the final session, Darren had a carafe of the latest synthetic brew sent to their quarters as a cultural courtesy. The delegation was confused. It was an illogical gesture. It broke protocol. They drank it out of politeness, their own analysts no doubt trying to decipher the intent behind the bitter, strange beverage. When the talks resumed, the mood had shifted. The formality had cracked. The other delegates were slightly off balance, wondering about the meaning of the drink. Darren used that. He was looser, more conversational. He made a joke about the coffee. It landed awkwardly, but it landed. The shared, slightly unpleasant experience of drinking the same terrible synthetic brew created a tiny, fragile bond. A shared moment of humanity or something like it. The negotiation concluded successfully. Not because of the coffee, but because the coffee had helped change the atmosphere. It had been a small, illogical risk that paid off. The resolution was silent but understood. The shared ritual of bad coffee had become a bonding mechanism. It was a reminder that sometimes the largest cultural gaps are bridged not by grand treaties, but by the smallest, most mundane things. A hot drink, a bad joke, a willingness to share in something that isn't perfect. When does a prison become home? The doors to the obsidian wing stayed open. No guard stood watch. Darren could walk the glowing hallways of the palace, visit the viewing platforms, even access the lower-level gardens. The freedom was a test, and he knew it. He walked the perimeter once just to see if they'd stop him. They didn't. He stood at the edge of the floating city, looking out at the starfield where human space was just a distant glimmer. The thought of going back felt like a demotion. On Kepler Station, he'd be just another soldier with a file full of classified trauma. Here he was something new. He was useful in a way that mattered. The offer came from Queen Azira herself. Permanent residence, official status as a diplomatic attaché, full citizenship rights. It was everything he'd fought for, laid out on a silver platter. It was also another kind of cage, just with a nicer view. So he negotiated. He didn't argue for himself. He argued for the next human. He demanded guarantees for any other human who might end up in Zephyrian space. Fair treatment, communication rights, legal representation. He turned his own freedom into a precedent. The Queen agreed. She saw the long-term value, stability, a framework for the future. His original captivity in the bazaar felt like a story someone else had told him. The energy shackles, the trader's grating voice, the smell of alien spices, it was all fading, replaced by the warm hum of the palace walls and the scent of ozone before a rain shower. This place knew his weight, his preferred temperature, the way he liked his terrible fake coffee. Kepler Station had been a series of identical gray corridors and recycled air. This was a living entity that adjusted to his mood. It was more of a home than any bunk or barracks had ever been. The anticipation of his decision built quietly. He didn't announce it. He just stopped talking about leaving. He started referring to the palace as here instead of this place. He found himself worrying about its structural integrity after a minor meteor shower, offering suggestions to Aramis for better defensive clustering. He was no longer a guest or a prisoner. He was part of the infrastructure. The resolution wasn't a signed document or a ceremony. It was a quiet evening in the obsidian wing. Lithra brought a new batch of the synthetic coffee, this one slightly less terrible than the last. They discussed a trade negotiation with a species that valued riddles over contracts. Darren made a suggestion involving a deliberately bad pun. Lethra's bioluminescent patterns flared with amusement as she saw the tactical advantage. Aramis adjusted the lighting to a comfortable twilight. In that moment, the question of freedom answered itself. It wasn't about lacking restraints. It was about having a purpose that fit. He had redefined himself from a soldier to a cosmic diplomat, not by changing worlds, but by finding the right one. How does one man's sarcasm change a civilization? The Zephyrians began weaving human concepts into their cultural fabric, thread by thread. They didn't adopt them wholesale. They adapted them. The changes weren't just improvements. They were trade-offs. Every gain came with a new problem. Their military doctrine, once a monument to predictable force, became a fluid, adaptable thing. Soldiers learned to improvise, to break formation when it made sense, to use an enemy's expectations against them. They were harder to beat. They were also harder to command. Predictability was replaced by a constant low-grade uncertainty. Officers had to trust their troops' judgment, not just their obedience. Their diplomacy shifted. Missions that once followed strict protocols now included creative overtures, illogical gestures, and calculated risks. They sent envoys who knew how to tell a joke. They made alliances based on shared curiosity instead of just shared resources. It led to breakthroughs with species they'd previously written off. It also led to spectacular, embarrassing failures. The Zephyrian reputation for flawless logic was replaced by a new one for unpredictable brilliance. They traded a safe, stagnant standing for a risky, dynamic one. Even their architecture evolved. The living palace, Aramis, and its siblings across the empire became more responsive. They learned from their human guest. Walls adjusted not just to physical needs but to emotional states. Buildings anticipated desires. This created an environment of profound comfort and understanding. It also created a demanding one. The structures now required emotional engagement. Apathy or frustration could cause systems to glitch. The buildings fed on interaction, on intellectual and emotional energy. A passive occupant was an inefficient one. The overall civilization became more resilient. They could handle shocks better, adapt to new threats faster, and solve problems they would have once considered impossible. But they also became more chaotic. Their society hummed with a new energy, but it was a less orderly hum. It was the sound of a machine that had learned to think for itself, with all the noise and friction that involved. The long-term consequences unfolded over years. There were crises, periods of instability where the old guard argued for a return to pure logic. But the genie was out of the bottle. The Zephyrians learned the hardest lesson of all, how to balance their innate logic with the creative chaos they'd adopted. They didn't abandon their core. They built a new structure around it, one that could accommodate paradox. Darren's legacy wasn't a statue or a renamed holiday. It was a civilization that had learned to embrace possibility. They understood that the right answer wasn't always the logical one, that strength could look like flexibility, that a joke could be as strategic as a shield. He gave them the tools to be more than they were, not by making them more human, but by showing them they could be more than just Zephyrian. They learned to hold two opposing ideas in their minds at once and still function. In the end, that was the most powerful weapon of all. Darren Mitchell's captivity became his opportunity. His humor, sharp, illogical human, didn't just save him. It reshaped an entire civilization's idea of strength. The Zephyrians learned to value adaptability over perfection, creativity over certainty. So when you're trapped in an impossible situation, remember, the right joke at the wrong time might be your best weapon. Sometimes the exit isn't a door. It's a change of perspective. Redefine the room you're in and you might just find you were never really trapped at all.